Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events this evening. And today we welcome back Beatriz Williams, our good friend, who has a brand new book out called The Wicked Widow, and she has signed a whole bunch of copies. And I will, here we go. We got various
with bookmarks and
swag.
postcards.
Yeah, very cool. So I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field to our web store if you'd like to purchase one. We don't have very many left. I just checked.
Oh, really? Well, I guess that's good news for me.
Yeah, I can always send you some more too.
I'm always happy to sign books for you.
Awesome. I'll be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for Beatriz throughout the hour, go ahead and put them in and I'll be happy to ask anything when Barbara summons me from the darkness. We have this little routine going. It's kind of fun. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Actually, Michael Connolly did it differently on Monday. He decided to be the producer of our program. So we ended up with a completely different structure, which he brought a certain Hollywood vibe to. But we're back to our normal routine, Patrick and I. So it was always a pleasure to talk to Beatriz. We've done many events together here in Scottsdale, and I wish that she were here, but instead, she has a nourishing beverage. So, Beatriz, to you.
Yes, cheers to you in my Wicked Widow mug. Luckily, I used Our Woman in Moscow mug for my morning coffee, so this was fresh and ready to go. I've been doing gin fizzes for all these online events, but we are now firmly into the autumn here in New England, and I thought, you know what, it's time to start getting the winter beverages. So this is the specialty of the house is my bourbon hot chocolate. It is my favorite winter evening drink when I need dessert in a cup. It's kind of, does everything. It's your dessert, it's your cocktail, it's everything together. So especially in the
it's absolutely perfect, in fact, for this book. I'm drinking.
Well, exactly, because you would put it in an inconspicuous, perfectly innocent mug in order to hopefully pull the wood over the eyes of any prohibition agent wandering through the territory.
That's true. In 1924, you had to use camouflage. I am drinking boring hot apple cider because it's not really, well, it is fall in Phoenix, meaning it's not over 80. You could put a
whiskey in there if you wanted to, I think. I don't know what goes well with apple cider. Well, other than hard apple cider, I mean, there's always.
I have encountered hard apple cider while in Normandy, and I'm not much of a drinker, so I have to tell you that hard apple cider at lunch in Normandy knocked me on my ass. I was just oh no, it's really alcoholic.
They are not messing around, and the winters there can be pretty tough, so I don't blame them. But yes,
very true. So here we are with The Wicked Widow, which is chapter 3 in the history of Geneva Kelly. And Beatriz, as I understand it, never actually meant to write more than one Beatriz Kelly. I'm not Beatriz, sorry, Geneva. Jinn, her name is Geneva Kelly, but somehow or other her story just doesn't seem to get finished. So we went on to a second book. Now we have a third book. There may be a fourth book, according to whatever I might have noted from you. Why are you so fascinated with this character?
Well, it's not quite true that I never intended to. I just sort of never told my editor that I intended to have multiple books. I didn't want to scare her off. It was really started, I was researching a certain age. So I decided to write a book about the 1920s. So I wrote A Certain Age, this was right after the Schuyler sister book. So I wanted to kind of do something, shift gears, shift time periods, do something a little different. So I wrote A Certain Age. And it's sort of a retelling. And actually, Barbara and I, one of the reasons we bond whenever I'm out there in Scottsdale, which I hope to be able to do before too much longer, we bond about opera. Barbara and I are both big opera fans. And A Certain Age I had sort of wanted to do a retelling of Richard Strauss's opera Der Rosenkavalier, set in 1920s Manhattan. I thought that a lot of the themes in that opera would play well in the 1920s because the lovely thing about human history is that we keep repeating ourselves, and many of these themes find new life in new generations. But as I was doing the research for that book, I just became really fascinated with Prohibition, which is obviously you need to study it if you're going to understand the 1920s, but it is kind of its own subject. I mean, it's such a big thing, from sort of the legal aspects of it, to the enforcement, to just the experience of the everyday person, to obviously the lawbreakers, the guys who are out there bringing booze to a thirsty American public. So all these things were sort of whirling in my head, and I was going through Western Maryland on my way to a book tour event, and I passed through this town, and amid a fair amount of rural poverty, there was this town that was clearly, I mean, it was it was a little shabby. It was definitely not in its heyday, but you could see that its heyday had been quite grand. Lots of beautiful stone buildings, sidewalks. So I got to the bookstore and asked the bookstore manager, and she said, "Oh, that was all built from bootlegging money during Prohibition." And of course, as you can imagine, my writer bells started ringing. But I knew that if I was going to write about Prohibition, it's such a big subject and it covers so many years. That if I were going to do it, I was sort of already envisioning a series. And I thought about this young woman who came down from a poor region in the Appalachians to start a new life in New York. And then, of course, her past catches up to her when a prohibition agent enlists her help to crack a bootlegging ring that is centered in her old hometown, run by her stepfather. So that was kind of the genesis of Jinn Kelly. My editor was sort of the one who threw in the idea for the modern day narrative that runs alongside it, partly because I also wanted to return to my Schuyler's. I had so many readers who wanted to know more about what happened to the three Schuyler sisters after the 1960s. So I thought, well, why not form an epilogue, form a parallel narrative, and then eventually connect the stories of Jinn Kelly and Ella Domerick as we realize the Schuylers have a role to play, as well as many of my other families that I have created in the course of my standalone books, as well as this series. So yes, I have I think I initially envisioned 2, maybe 3 books, but these cliffhangers just happened at the end of The Wicked Widow. So I think I'm going to have to write a 4th. I'm certainly getting a lot of communication from readers that they want a 4th. So I hope my editor is listening.
Oh, I hope so too. So the first one's called The Wicked Widow, and the second one's called The Wicked Redhead, meaning Jinn. And now we are into The Wicked Widow. Did I say Wicked City? Did I get it right?
Oh, yeah, sorry, Wicked City.
Redhead,
yes,
Wicked
yeah.
Widow. Right. So I mean, wicked, it's it's kind of a nice word to keep using as we move along. And the good news is that you can inch your way through the 20s, because if you're writing historicals, you don't have to write them in real time because it's already passed. So you can do, month to month or whatever you feel like in the 1920s. But Jinn has certainly come along. One of the things I think is interesting, and I really noted it, Beatrice, in reading this, is you have a very different voice for Jinn Kelly than you do for Ella in the modern thing. So in addition to the helpful chapter headings, so the reader is not, excuse me, lost as to what point of view we're in, it really is a very different voice. So did the Jinn Kelly voice come naturally to you, or did you have to develop it?
It was a little both. I knew from the beginning that she was going to have a very unusual upbringing. So she grows up in rural Appalachia, and but she goes off to a convent for her education. So she does sort of learn a different way of speaking there. And so she's a bit of a chameleon. She speaks one way when she's with, the home folks. She speaks another way when she is with, her New York friends, and, kind of a combination of both when she's relaxed, when she's with people she really trusts. So, I sort of knew, I would say the rhythm and the cadence came very naturally. I did do a lot of research into not just sort of, Appalachian modes of speech in the current day, but also I had to kind of go back into the past. I mean, how were people speaking back in the 1920s? So I did do a lot of research. I found sort of old YouTube videos of old film of people in the 1920s, that kind of thing, that really kind of helped me sort of go from the page with the sort of phonetic descriptions of dialect to like how people actually spoke. So it was a combination of that. But then once I sort of found her voice, and it was funny, once I started writing her, the voice just kind of, it was right there. I don't know where I was able to access it from, but it was right there. And every time I return to this character, it's just like when you learn a language and you can just slip back into that language. She is such a vibrant character. There are some characters you need to really write a long time before you feel like you know them. But I really felt like I knew Jinn from the beginning. I got what made her tick. The fact that she exists, as a lot of my characters do, but particularly this one, in a liminal space between two different worlds. And that creates so many different layers in a character. She's been an absolute joy to write from the beginning. I think a lot of my sort of core readers agree with me that this is really one of the most interesting characters in all of my books. And it's certainly the one that gives me the most joy to write. I love returning to Jinn and her voice.
Well, she's got a very distinctive voice, her interior voice, I think,
Yes.
and it's not necessarily grammatically or, polished
Yes.
or whatever it is. But as she's upscaling her life, as we say,
Yes.
her exterior voice, her conversation has to kind of go up. And so you do a good job, I think, tick-tocking back and forth.
Well, it's a bit like modern art. You kind of have to know what the rules are in order to break them. So, I love playing around with the grammar and the usage and the syntax with Jinn. I mean, knowing what, constitutes the correct mode of writing and speaking, to play around with that, to kind of turn the words around. To turn the syntax around, the sentence around. And sometimes she does it deliberately, and sometimes it comes naturally. And sometimes she's trying to sort of exaggerate it for you because she's trying to make a point about herself and your assumptions about her. That's one of the themes of the book, is that we perceive people a certain way. We perceive someone like Jinn as being wicked, and she knows that we do, and she plays with those assumptions. And so sometimes her mannerisms and her grammar and her speech are a bit exaggerated because she's kind of throwing it back in your face a little bit, like, okay, this is how you think I am. Here it is. Here's what you want from me. And playing around with that is really what gives Jinn and the scenes with Jinn that texture that to me at least makes her such a real character, real person in my own head.
Well, I have to say that the situations both for Jinn and for Ella are certainly not black and white. They are morally complex, shall I say. Involve a lot of fluid relationships, a lot of old and present a lot of complicated loyalties and family loyalties. But the thing that binds them in this book is really the family Hardcastle. The old man, Lewis, I think his name is,
Yes.
Who was the principal bootlegger, the sort of patriarch of this bootlegging dynasty. And then the modern one. And, honestly, it's the Kennedys. I mean, you can you have to be, you'd really have to be unaware not to recognize the Kennedys in this, because in the modern story, Frank Hardcastle, a descendant that wants to run for president. He's kind of a golden boy, but that there's some really difficult family history because there's an aunt called Julia who has a long-standing grudge, shall we say, against the Hardcastles. But the matriarch of the Hardcastles had at least 8 children, and so there we are. I have a really great story to tell you that you're going to truly love.
I love your stories.
Well, this one is just, it's so perfect for this book. I laughed all the way through when I did it. Some years ago, my husband and I did a round trip across the North Atlantic and back, from up through Canada and across over to Norway and down to France, and then up around Ireland and then back. And on our way back from France, we stopped offshore Canada. There are two little islands called Saint-Pierre and
Yes.
Miquelon. And they actually are French, even though they are just offshore of Eastern Canada. They are part of the province of Brittany. And at one point, they had their own archbishop, you know, the whole bit. So very French. So during the Prohibition era, they were French. Canada was Canada. The United States was the United States, and everybody had different laws about the consumption of liquor. The French, unsurprisingly, never bought into Prohibition. I mean, why would they? So we land on these two little islands. It's a day trip off the ship, and we observe that there are these wooden buildings everywhere, but we look around on these two islands and they are like barren. There is not a tree to be seen anywhere. And so we're going, what happened here? How did they manage to build all these wooden structures and so forth? Because you'd think they'd be stoned, right? Or possibly brick or something, but definitely not wood. So I'm an inquiring mind. So when we went to the little museum, I said, how come all the buildings are made out of wood? You don't have any trees. And they said, well, it was Prohibition. They said what happened was that Joe Kennedy used Saint-Pierre-Miquelon as the apex of his Prohibition rum running. And so the Canadians would bring the liquor in wooden cases to these two little islands, and they would break up the wooden cases and they would load all the liquor onto Joe Kennedy's boat so he could run it down to Boston. And so there was all this wood lying around. And the natives said, well, you know, we might as well use it.
The free
and
wood.
Then they treated us to a whole dissertation about Joe Kennedy and his bootlegging rum running operation from these two French islands supplied by the Canadians. I think it was probably the Bronfmans, in fact, that
Bronfmans as well. And you will not surprise you, Barbara, that in fact, that whole sort of triangulation of Canada sort of laundering its liquor through French-owned Saint-Pierre was, in fact, that sort of formed a lot of the sort of the backbone of the plot in The Wicked Redhead, which dealt with which dealt with that, the rum running operations on the high seas. I found it so fascinating that here were these tiny little nothing islands that suddenly became wealthy boom towns as a result of Prohibition and these liquor laws, and just the unique status of being able to essentially, like launder your liquor through, so that the Canadians could, launder it through Saint-Pierre to get it to the US. And, when the Hardcastles, I sort of created this family when I was writing Tiny Little Thing. And the difference obviously is they are Protestant, not Catholic, but it's kind of the same idea. And so I always knew, at the sort of the end of Tiny Little Thing, there's this question mark. We know that the Hardcastle wealth is kind of shrouded in secrecy and possible, rum dealings, literally. And we know that the Hardcastles back in the day did some terrible things. It's sort of part of the plot, and but we don't know exactly what. So I was like, okay, that was one of those things that I had shelved to deal with later. And I knew that, once I was dealing in Prohibition with the Wicked City, that at some point that was all going to come together. So everyone who loved Tiny Little Thing, like, oh, when do we hear more about Tiny and Caspian and the Hardcastles? I was like, just wait, I've got it all planned out, and so here we are, and finding out exactly what the Hardcastles were up to in the first half of the century. And yes, I was sort of definitely inspired by, people like the Kennedys and the Bronfmans, who had this source of wealth back in the early days that would certainly not pass muster today. So, it was fascinating to do the research on that, and how the later generations sort of, whitewash or greenwash, I think is the term, the sources of the family money. And then all of a sudden you end up being these very, important socially and politically families. So, but, Aunt Julie is my secret keeper. She knows where all the skeletons lurk in all the closets. So, there's Aunt Julie off in her retirement home out in the end of Long Island, causing trouble and stirring the pot, which is my favorite thing to have her do.
Well, she lives to a long age, which is a good thing because somebody needs a memory of what it was like then. But, it's so interesting. Yeah, I grew up just north of Evanston, Illinois, which was the headquarters of the Women's Temperance Union, and the women who really, intended to do a good thing. They really hated the demon rum, and they thought that prohibition was somehow going to make us all better. And they never understood the fallout. Well, I mean, who would have guessed about the wooden houses on St. Pierre-Miquelon, which I think is hilarious, but nonetheless, they didn't understand that they were opening the door really to crime. And, they brought in the mafia, they brought in the Chicago gangs, they enabled.
All had its start back in Prohibition.
Yeah, it really did. And so in attempting to legislate what they thought would be something good and morally right and, helpful for society, instead they opened the door to a lot of really black things, evil deeds and so forth, some of which are still with us. And, the war on drugs is really not any different. We have a parallel. And, even legalizing marijuana, and I'm not taking a position pro or con, Arizona has legalized marijuana, but it's the same thing, can you, or smoking cigarettes, can you really legislate behavior? Or are you better off to tax it to death and hope that, make it so expensive?
Has a more salutary effect on human behavior than trying to legislate, that's for sure. I mean, look, I think prohibition is really, a perfect real world illustration of the law of unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
We go out thinking with very high-minded ideas, thinking that we know best for everybody else. And it turns out we don't. And, I think one of the aspects of prohibition that really moved me the most was the way it turned, the people who really bore the brunt of prohibition were immigrants, were people from different ethnic backgrounds, many in Europe for whom drinking was just part of the everyday family culture. Nobody was drinking to excess necessarily, but, kids would have a glass of beer with dinner and that was just what they did. And, and to criminalize that, I think they felt was high-handed. And I think a lot of people who were not, who were of more Anglo-Saxon background felt the same thing, like that the government shouldn't be in the business of telling me what I can and cannot drink in the privacy of my own home. I mean, technically they weren't. It was the creation and sale and transportation of alcohol technically that was prohibited. But, I think people felt that this was a really unwarranted intrusion and that this was an unjust sort of a vocal and very politically astute minority. It was a large minority, but still a minority, imposing its ideas of morality on the larger public.
Well,
and
but to be fair, I think part of it was a health thing. They thought that people were ruining their health with drinking and that, by keeping alcohol away from them, they would make them healthier. But unfortunately, what happened was that it allowed adulteration with all kinds of other substances. And we're seeing that again. I mean, I'm not pushing drugs or anything, but I'm making a parallel that heroin, for example, is cut with fentanyl today. That, there are all kinds of more harmful substances being introduced into things that people are taking. And the same was true with what we call bathtub gin. People could go blind, people could have all kinds of major health disasters and die even from the kind of unsupervised and unregulated distillation that went on during Prohibition. So,
Yeah, one of the things that I, as again, doing all this research on prohibition, and there absolutely were very unscrupulous people, because once you put alcohol into the realm of illegality, you have people who are willing to break the law. in order to make a book. And some of those people have a certain code of honor. Some of them don't, or some of them are just really good business people. I sort of referenced this guy who was out in the Midwest, and people trusted him because they knew that, the liquor they bought from him was what it said on the label. But one of the ways that the government, with, again, the very best intentions in the world, tried to regulate the illegal liquor trade was that, of course, you still had to make alcohol for industrial purposes. It served a lot of uses that, did not involve being ingested into the human body. But so in order to create that, though, it had to be denatured. In other words, poison had to be put in it so that people would not drink it. Well, of course, what happened, unscrupulous people would take this denatured alcohol and sell it to people. And people were so desperate to drink that they would drink it, even though they knew it could kill them. And it happened very frequently. So very smart businessmen tried to develop a more legitimate business model, which would deliver trustworthy booze into people's hands. But of course, the more you tried to do that, the more likely you were to be a target of the Prohibition Bureau. So they were sort of stamping out the guys who at least had, a code of professional ethics, if for business reasons, if for nothing else. And then you end up with just purely the unscrupulous people. So again, unintended consequences. And, I certainly, in the course of writing this book, I was not trying to draw that parallel, the war on drugs now, because obviously if you're going to be dealing with unintended consequences, everything has an unintended consequence. Whenever you create a law, there's going to be, an opposite reaction. And so you have to ask yourself as a legislator, as a member of the public voting for legislators who are creating laws, is the likely outcome, is sort of the cure going to be worse than the disease itself? Are these unintended consequences things we can live with for the greater benefit of this law that is being enacted, or is it just not worth it? And of course, that is what we figured out 11 or 12 years later, that prohibition was just not worth it. And, here we are today.
Well, here we are. Actually, the safest liquor was the moonshine made in Appalachia. But the real reason that we brought
because
this
they were
up,
drinking it themselves. So, they didn't want to kill themselves. So,
very true. But the reason I brought it up was that in order to pursue the Hardcastles, which are, their actions are among the core issues in this novel, we have to give you a background as to why, in fact, they have a shrouded history. All of which is not, I have to say, revealed in this book. But anyway, so what's really going on, though, in part, are these two really interesting romances, one involving Jinn and Beatrice can tell us, Anson, who was a scion of a family and also in Prohibition law enforcement. And then we have Ella, who, interestingly enough, is pregnant by the man she's divorcing. Apparently they had sort of a farewell and she got pregnant, but she's really in love with a new guy who is going to be the father. And so it's very complicated, both in 1920s and in the more modern story. It's extremely complicated. So how do you think all that up? I mean, those are really tortured relationships in lots of ways, although hugely loving and fascinating to read about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting that you talk about the complicated moral scenarios in both storylines, because I wanted to do that deliberately. You get a lot of time to think during COVID and I was really, and it was actually my father who sort of said, my father, God bless him, reads all of my books and, and has a lot of really thoughtful things to say about them afterward. And he said, all of your books at the end of the day, what ties them together is this notion of forgiveness, that we all screw up, because we do. I think, there's the 10% of the population that is, truly psychopaths. And the rest of us are just trying to do our best with a lot of self-interest mixed in there. So, and with varying degrees of altruism in there. So we're all going to screw up. And we need to have the humility to ask to recognize when we've screwed up or played a role in whatever has gone wrong, and to ask for forgiveness. And also we have to be good enough to extend that forgiveness, because, we're going to screw up as well. So I was really kind of trying to deal with that on both levels, on both sides of the generational divide here. Ella, of course, has, at the very beginning of Wicked City, she's just left her husband because she's discovered he's been cheating on her the entire time. Just your classic sort of charming guy who is leading a dual life. And she leaves him and very soon, falls in love with the guy who is sort of the guy managing the apartment building that she moves into. And it turns out he's, related to the owner, and some very ghostly happenings are going on in this building. So, the first 2 books have kind of dealt with that. And then, of course, we're dealing with some of the baggage left over from the Schuyler sister books. Pepper, Schuyler, is, of course, Ella's mother. And we realize, if you're sort of an attentive reader of the earlier books, that Ella must, of course, be the baby that Pepper was pregnant with during Along the Infinite Sea, and indeed part of Tiny Little Thing. So we know that Ella is kind of in the same situation as her baby, that the father of the child is not the guy who's going to be raising the child. So we see sort of history repeating itself. And so Ella's, dealing with the past as she's dealing with the present. How does she forgive her mother and her parents for keeping this secret from her, for letting it happen to begin with? How does she apply those lessons to what's going on in her own life? Oh, yes. And deal with the fact that Aunt Julie wants her to uncover this, generations long, conspiracy to do with the Hardcastles. So Ella's got a lot on her plate, and again, Jinn as well, she has been through so much, and she's finally allowed herself to trust this man. But the problem is, he is kind of cheating on her a bit too, in the sense that, his job and his sort of calling, this need he has to see justice done, means that he is going to be leaving Jinn and doing this thing that he thinks is right. So, it's all about that sense of loyalty, and what do we owe loyalty to, and how much do we give people the freedom to to do the things that they think are right, to make these choices that are impossible choices. You see something wrong, you see people suffering, you see an injustice, and you want to address that, but you also owe loyalty to the person that you love. And so how do you reconcile that? So, the book is all about that sort of tangle of the conflict between your public duty and what you owe to society and to humanity and to the people around you, but also what you owe to the person that you love, the person who has placed their trust in you at a personal level. So that conflict between the public and the personal, has kind of been a theme that I've been dealing with, if you paid attention, a lot of my books lately. And it really kind of comes into high relief in this book. And how do you resolve that? Can you resolve that? How do you forgive somebody who has chosen, chosen the path that is not, the most favorable option for you?
Well, on a broader scale too, you have to decide what your definition of family is. Because these are not, as the families turn out, they're not entirely conventional, since the children are fathered by one person and raised by another. How does everybody deal with that? What sort of, family gathering are you going to have at Christmas, for example? How's Ella going to deal with the baby and Hector, and then the baby's father, Patrick? And there's a very good scene in the book where Ella and Patrick talk about how they're going to manage that, or how she talks about how she's going to manage that. And it gives you, because there's so many fluid family structures today, let's say, that this plays right into that. There's also a question for Ella, which you didn't raise, about Patrick. Not only was cheating on her with women, but he may have been involved in something more complicated at the office. And she's an accountant, so in her background in accountancy, she may have noticed something very telling. So it's not necessarily a local drama. There's political overtones to it, which you have set it up so you could explore it on that level. What decade are we in with Ella?
It's the 1990s. It was 1998. So Aunt Julie, I've sort of mentioned this in previous talks. She is a little bit based on a real life Aunt Julie, who was the great aunt of my husband. So my mother-in-law's aunt, her mother's sister. And she was kind of everything as advertised. She had a one name reference in the post. She was just Julie. If you sort of can dig up old old editions of the New York Post, when she got married, it was Julie Weds. It was she was definitely somebody who was known in social circles. She was an absolute social butterfly. She was dating Ty Cobb. She would sneak out of the family. And by the way, that family mansion was actually the model for the mansion we used in The Forgotten Room is the basis for that mystery. So she was actually sneaking out and going and dating these guys in the 1920s. She was a total flapper. But what was interesting to me, she ended up making a very conventional marriage. And she ended up actually very unhappy. Her husband was a philanderer. And there is an episode in Our Woman in Moscow that is actually taken from something that happened to Aunt Julie. She and her husband were out at a party. The nanny called saying the child has a stomach ache, and she said, well, just deal with it. It turned out the child had appendicitis. This is before antibiotics, and the child unfortunately passed away. So she lived with that guilt as well. So she had a lot of tragedy. She made a lot of mistakes. She's not my Aunt Julie is not a carbon copy, but I just found it interesting that having had such an unconventional, time as a single person, once she married again, she wasn't going to give up the status that her background had conferred on her. And Julie my Julie's kind of the same way. So she is rebellious in many ways, but she's also the keeper of the family secrets. She is, kind of the one who makes sure that the family's interests come first. And so that's one of the reasons why the situation with the Hardcastles. And I guess actually, for those of you who haven't yet read The Wicked Widow, in the very first scene of the book, we find out that, Frank Hardcastle, this is Tiny's ex-husband from Tiny Little Thing. It's now, 30 years later, and he's running for president. And so that's what sort of sets Aunt Julie off. Like, this family can never occupy the White House. I know what they did. So that's what kind of sets that off. So, but what is great about Aunt Julie is that, she is kind of complicated. She's right, but she's also sort of wrong, because, we're led to believe that Frank Hardcastle himself, his hands are the family has kept his hands clean. He might actually make a pretty good president for all we know. So, is what she is doing right at all? And Patrick, from the beginning of The Wicked City, we absolutely hate this guy. I mean, I just made that episode where, where Ella discovers he's been cheating on her. I deliberately made it as visceral as possible. He goes down to get the takeout pizza, supposedly. He's been there a while, so she goes down to figure out what's taking him so long. And he is, actually having sex with a prostitute in the stairwell. And she's sort of staring there, watching this happen, going, frozen, like unable to believe she's actually seeing this. So we kind of hate him from the beginning, and he keeps trying to say, oh, I'll stop, I'll do better. And we hate him so much. But we get to this book and we find out he's not all bad, and he does care about her. And it's sort of like, he doesn't even know why he cheats. He's like, I love you, I just can't seem to stop myself. It's like, it's sort of parallel to an alcohol addiction. And, some bad things happen to him later in The Wicked Widow that Ella feels are her fault, and that elicits some sympathy for him until a final maybe plot twist at the end sucks it back away. But the people are complicated. It's not like Patrick is like the worst person in the world. He's just a bit of a screw up when it comes to his personal life and his inability to control his impulses. And so that puts the burden on Ella to forgive him if she can. And also to figure out, how am I going to make a life with this guy, this somewhat toxic person still in my life, because we have this child. And, unless, Patrick commits murder or something, this child has a right to know and have a relationship with the biological father. So how do you resolve that? There is no easy answer. And I don't think I'm going to paint it ever by the end neatly tied up with a bow, because we know it's not going to be neatly tied up with a bow.
Well, if obviously you put the baby in there to enforce, the fact that they can't ever fully divorce because they do have this child together, which creates all kinds of interesting loyalties. And, Aunt Julie may be protecting the family, but I'll come back to my point is, what is the family? How do you define it? So moving on from The Wicked Widow, what are you working on next? Are you writing a novel with your two cohorts, Karen White and Lauren Willig again?
Gosh, yes. Well, actually, we're done writing it. It is called The Lost Summers of Newport. It takes place in Newport, Rhode Island, in, of course, the Gilded Age, in the 1950s, which we chose because that was kind of the period where Newport was transitioning from being this, these great mansions being owned by the families that had built them, to becoming white elephants and eventually coming mostly into the hands of the Preservation Society, which is now known as Newport Mansions. And you can visit.
Well, I have myself been there several times and hiked the cliff walk, and
it's amazing. And we were supposed to go visit during our research and outlining phase, but unfortunately that coincided with the outbreak of COVID. So we had to do all of that online. I live not too far away from Newport, about hour and a half away. So I was able to go a couple of times and take some photos and do some Facebook living, or some not some Facebook live, but some FaceTiming with Karen and Lauren, so we could do as much on-site research as possible. And then, of course, we met to, put all the threads together and finish it off and polish it up and send it off to our editor back in August. So that was really wonderful. The third narrative takes place in almost modern day. It takes place in the summer of 2019, because we did not want to deal with COVID and the summer of 2020 when we were writing the book. So it is not quite the present day. And it's funny because, writing it was a bit more disjointed than our usual experience writing together, because we couldn't meet in person and because we had all these distractions and everything was shifting around us, not just, what was going on in the world, but publication dates and due dates for manuscripts and all this stuff. Everything was constantly changing. So, we sort of handed it in and we're like, this feels pretty good. And, but you don't know until you hear back from your editor. And our editor came back, she's like, oh my gosh, this is like the best manuscript I've edited in like months. I love it, love it, love it. And in fact, they changed our publication date, which was supposed to be September of 2022. It is now May. They're going to launch it as a big summer book. So stay tuned. There are going to be all kinds of fun in-person events, including we're working on a book launch in Newport itself, which will be, well, I'm not going to tell you because nothing's sort of been resolved yet. So as soon as we have something concrete, we will obviously let you know. But we got some very fun, exciting stuff possibly in the works.
Oh, that's wonderful. I certainly hope
it's going to be a really fun summer. I think. I hope, hopefully we'll be back enough to normal that all of you can join us and we can kind of feel like, we can meet again and have fun again. And gosh, I think we just all miss that face-to-face interaction so much. And we certainly hope we can come out to Arizona and see you, Barbara, because, you're always at the top of our list for book tour, not least because, hey, Scottsdale is a really nice place to visit. We always try and engineer it around, a 2-night stay or a weekend if we can, to get the most out of the trip.
Absolutely. I'm sorry it's May, because February is actually a lot nicer to visit Scottsdale, but
Might have to do the very beginning of the tour rather than the end of the tour.
right. Well, we have no control over the heat. Last year we had no autumn at all. It was 100 degrees early in November, and this year we really had a very nice. It was very strange. It was hotter and more miserable in Seattle and Portland when it was relatively cool and rainy in Phoenix. So the weather things are completely confused, but we'll hope for the best. Patrick, let's call you up and see if there are questions or if you have anything you'd like to say.
Yeah, let's see here. There is a question from Anissa, I think, or Anissa, who says, I like that you put your characters through a lot and believe that is one of the reasons why your books are so good. Who has been your hardest character to write and why?
Ooh, great question.
Oh, golly. The hardest character to write is always the one I'm writing right now. Usually. Actually, the funny thing is, the reason I didn't even tell my editor I was working on book number 3. I started writing The Wicked Widow at the end of the COVID summer. I was definitely I was in a funk, I'm not afraid to admit it. It had been a very tough summer. It had been hard to get the word out about this book that I adored. Her Last Flight was, it had been a while since I really just connected with the book at such a deep level, and to be unable to, get out there and get the word out. And there were so many distractions. And I knew that my little book was very small in the grand scheme of things that summer. It was tough. A lot of other stuff going on, just bringing my family through the whole COVID experience, a lot of ups and downs. So, the kids, my 2 oldest went off to college, and I was like, I need to write something for fun again, to really just write without worrying about what I'm writing it for. And so I thought, I've been meaning to write the 3rd book in the Wicked City series forever. We kind of shelved it for a while because it doesn't fit neatly into the summer book mold, right? So I thought, I'm just going to write this thing. And I'll tell you, it absolutely turned everything around for me. Just sitting in the morning, not even opening up social media, anything, just sitting down with a cup of coffee and writing for an hour or 2, and just plunging into, and just, the intensity, just circling back to Anissa's question, the intensity of what is happening, the bad things that are happening. There were literally scenes where my editor came back and was like, you need to tone that down a little bit. That's a little extreme. So there are a few scenes that had to be toned down, which is the first time that has ever happened to me before. I'm a diplomat. I was like the 2nd child. My parents were divorced. I was always like trying to smooth things over. It's very hard for me to put my characters through hardship. I'm always trying to make them feel better. So for me to go and put them in these extreme situations was both tough and cathartic. And it's funny because I have just received so much positive response about this book. I was actually nervous. I'm like, are my readers going to want to follow me into some of these dark holes that I'm taking my characters? And it turns out, you guys love that. God bless you, but I handed it to my editor, and she's like, oh, okay, where are we going to fit this into your publishing schedule? I guess we'll try for, the autumn. And so that's what we did. And it's kind of all worked out, and everybody's loving it so much. So I'm taking note of all the comments and messages I'm getting about book 4, we need a book 4. And to send them all to my editor and be like, see, we have to do book 4 now, because my readers will never forgive me if we don't.
Well, there are quite a few comments about that here. Let's see here. Another question that's come in. What is a typical writing day for you when you're not doing laundry?
This is a reference to my bio, which says I divide my time. It's funny. To me, it's not a joke. I do divide my time between writing and laundry and making dinner and grocery shopping, all that. Luckily, now that I do have 2 children off at college, the laundry burden is not as bad for at least for sort of 8 months of the year or so. And actually, my 13-year-old daughter is suddenly like, I'm going to do my own laundry, Mom, and help you out. And I'm like, can you just, communicate this to your siblings, because that would be helpful. I try to, the great thing about the Wicked Widow was I got into this wonderful, I was just so in the flow. I think if you read about sort of the creative process, there's this whole thing around being in the flow and how sometimes you need to force yourself into it. There are so many distractions now, way more than when I started writing, when I just had a little BlackBerry, and no business of writing things to deal with, and not social media and all of that. And I found it much easier to slip into the flow because I didn't have all these distractions. I could go to, my husband could watch the kids, and I could go to, the coffee shop and get 2 solid hours in, just slip right in. Now it's harder, with the Wicked Widow, it was easier because I just got into this wonderful habit, and I had so much joy writing it. And I deliberately, because there was just all this kind of negative stuff out there that I didn't want to deal with. So it was very easy to be like, my phone is going in the other room. I am in this room with my coffee and my laptop, and I'm turning off the internet, and I'm just gonna write. And I do need to slip back into that. It's been a very distracting autumn for a lot of different reasons. And the book that I'm writing, I really love, but I've just had a harder time. And maybe because knowing these characters, knowing Jinn, knowing Ellen, knowing Hector, knowing Anson, and all the sort of side characters, it was just so easy to slip in because I didn't have to learn anything new. I had to plot out something new, but I didn't need to learn any new main characters. And right now I'm still learning these characters. And with all the distractions, the words don't come as easily when you don't know what the character is really thinking inside. So it has been a challenge. I'm finally getting over that hump a bit with this book. So bear with me, everybody. We're getting there. This morning I had a great writing session where I just did the coffee, ignored the internet, and just, suddenly a few things clicked, and I'm really getting to know this main character, and it's kind of getting there. So every book is different. I wish I could give you a great answer to that question. Here's the solution, and here's how I divide my time. But it definitely depends on the book. And I think that's why I would love to write a 4th Wicked City book, because again, it's just so much easier to slip into a series book, even if you're like, okay, how do I make it fresh? At least who your people are and what your choice is.
Do you have a tentative title for the 4th book yet?
Well, here's the we actually went through a few different, if you were kind of following me along after I sort of finished it, I didn't tell anyone. I sent an email to my agent saying, surprise, I just wrote the 3rd Wicked City book. And the working title was The Wicked Prince, which I think you can kind of figure out if you've read the book why I might have sort of been the working title. They didn't like it. They thought it sounded too kind of fantasy or, it didn't sort of fit the genre. So for a while it was going to be The Demon Liquor, because I thought, well, demon, it had the same kind of rhythm to it, but like just in a different key, The Demon Liquor. But that didn't play well in the marketing meetings. I guess the marketing people were confused by the reference, the demon rum. And so we came up with saying, come up with something else. And I suddenly was like, oh, The Wicked Widow. And I know a lot of people were very scared by that. They're like, oh my God, but there are several different candidates for who the widow might be. And also widowhood can be a fluid concept. I'm trying not to give away any spoilers here, but yes. And as soon as I said The Wicked Widow, all the light bulbs went on. There are certain words that book title people love, marketing departments love, wife, summer, and woman, and widow is one of them. Widow is one of those evocative words, that is like, just kind of captures a reader's imagination. So everyone was super happy with The Wicked Widow. Whew, I don't know what we would call the fourth one. I think I would have to plot it out first at the very least. In order, I kind of know where things are headed, but you got to figure out how to get there. So I would have to figure out that plot first before I could even begin to think of another amazing title with a word that the marketing department loves to see on a book cover.
Well,
Did you have a hand?
almost have to do wicked, so it'll have to be a wicked something.
Yeah.
Well, my editor is always like, so can you come up with another title with the word summer in it? And I'm like, does it? I mean, really, are readers that, literal where it has to have the word summer? She's like, well, the sales department says yeah. So I'm like, all right, we'll try to think of another twist on summer. But yeah, so we're like, how about the Lost? I think that's why they made it a summer book. They did not want to waste a good use of the word summer with the Lost Summers of Newport. So we had a
Did you have a hand into this wonderful cover design? I really like it.
Oh, isn't it fabulous? Yes. The remit was make it glamorous 20s, but not cheesy. So many of the images they use can be like stock images of modern people posing as flappers. And sometimes that works and sometimes it badly does not work. And I'm not even sure which one that is. I'm guessing it might be posed actually, because it's almost too perfect, isn't it? And with the city in the background, and they did an amazing job of just giving it a glamorous yet kind of classy and noiry look. So yes, kudos to the amazing design team. And hopefully if we do a fourth, we can capture that same look as well. Different, but the same, as they like to say.
One of our viewers just tuned in with the obvious answer, which is Wicked Summer.
The Wicked Summer. There we go. Exactly. I don't know. The problem is, I think the challenge with this book has always been that it does not fit into the summer book mold. So, I'm not sure if I'd be too much of a genre smash up there although actually there are some beachy scenes there at the end of The Wicked Widow. So I don't know, maybe it can be done.
Wicked Winter would be nice, but it's too close to Wicked. Too close to Wicked Widow.
Wicked August. I think Wicked August could actually work very well.
Yeah.
I kind of like that. I've always thought that a great book title for me, given 100 summers, what if I did 100 winters or The Winter Wives, right? Silence? No? Okay. All right.
The Winter Wives.
The Winter Wives.
Because we had the Wicked Winter Wives.
The Wicked Winter Wives. There you go.
Little alliteration.
We have a lot of fun. The orphan, wicked winter widows on the train, or something like that. So we could really capture it all.
Love it. Anything else, Patrick?
Yeah. I love these kind of pun titles too.
Sometimes you just get a little fed up. And actually that was how we came up with the Summer Wives, because they were like, no, we need summer. We need something that has really good words in it. And I was like, how about the Summer Wives? It's like, you love wives, you love summer. And they're like, actually, that's perfect. And I said, well, I guess, yeah, they're kind of like, okay, yeah, we can make it work. So I had a very intellectual answer when people asked me, so why is it called the Summer Wives? Like, it was like, well, because these women you had one, it was, yeah.
We have quite a tradition out here.
You could look at it a certain way and it fit. Yes. Yeah.
There was a tradition of that here in Phoenix too, in early Phoenix, of the Summer Wives.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Pat asks, were you a reader before you were a writer? And I just lost it. Okay, favorite authors and influences. And at what age did you begin writing?
Oh gosh, I was absolutely always a reader. My mother taught me to read at a very young age. It was kind of a fad thing to do. And so she did, and I was kind of off and running from there. I was very much into the childhood classic series, Little House on the Prairie, the Wizard of Oz books, the Black Stallion books, Anne of Green Gables, all the classics. And then my father, who's actually British, sort of drew me into the sort of the 19th century canon. So I read all of those as I moved into the teen years. Obviously, Austen And I actually had a huge I read a little Trollope when I was young, but I had a huge Trollope phase when I was going through business school, because I could not have survived getting my MBA in finance if I did not have something actually interesting to read when I was not studying. And so I read through all of Trollope. And if and as you know, Trollope as well does this thing. He has like this universe, right, of characters that pop in and out of each other's books. And so I wasn't thinking of it consciously when I started doing that in my own books, but that was definitely inspired by Trollope for sure. So yeah, those were kind of, the big influences early on. And then when I was very much, just the traditional 19th century British canon. And then when I was in college, I took a class on turn of the century Europe. And that sort of moment of transition between the capital R romanticism of that 19th century canon and the modernism that was sort of the seeds of the kind of literature and the bifurcations in literature that we see today, and as well as all art and really all sort of, Western culture that underwent this transition. And it really kind of was had its starting point before the First World War, but it really kind of entered the mainstream in the post-World War I period. I have a very long talk about all this that I sometimes do.
The whole Paris scene.
Big talk. But one book in particular that, and I think because it was a memoir, really, I think captured my imagination and opened my eyes and all of those things and turned me on to that sort of early modernist period, World War I and the interwar period. And that was Vera Britton's book, A Testament of Youth, which I actually, when I first read it, and I got to the point where her fiance is shot by a sniper in France, and he's this, golden boy, just amazing, everything perfect, and he's shot by a sniper and dies, and she gets the news right before he's supposed to come home for Christmas, and devastation. I literally could not read past that chapter. I didn't even want to live in a world where Roland was dead. It was just personally very devastating to me, especially because it was true. It had actually happened. And in fact, as soon as I could, when I went to France, I actually was able by train and taxi to visit his grave in this tiny, tiny village not far from Albert, and visit his actual grave. And, and it was really one of those turning points for me in terms of what was capturing my imagination, what was interesting to me, and what eventually kind of inspired me to write the periods that I wanted to write about. And so that book, and of course, I eventually did read all the way through. I was able to get over my grief over Roland and continue, much like Vera herself in her own life. But that was really, for me, if there's one book that set me on the course that I ended up writing on today. And of course, I was getting back to the writing question. I was always a scribbler as a child, constantly writing stories. But like I said, my problem was I had no problem. I couldn't give my characters problems. So what I used to write was very, very boring. And it sort of took me getting older and learning that strife was not permanent. And, you had to work through strife, and it was not a death sentence. And to really kind of understand that conflict is the core of narrative. But actually, I cannot go through influences without mentioning Patrick O'Brian, although that does bring us back to the 19th century. But Patrick O'Brian himself was more contemporary. He wrote in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. But his books about his historical novels about the Great Britain during the Napoleonic era, particularly the British Navy, and it sort of follows a 20 novel long friendship between a frigate captain and his ship surgeon, who is a naturalist, but also turns out is a spy for the British intelligence services. And it's just so brilliantly written, so smart and lyrical, and a perfect illustration of how, in my view, historical fiction should be written, which is without judgment and without a sense of being a contemporary looking back on a historical period. It's obviously not written in the voice of, of somebody writing in the early 19th century. It's not Jane Austen. It is a contemporary author, but it so perfectly captures the sense and the texture of life in that period and on a British sailing ship and around the world, without ever lecturing to you about the period. You just understand it by the setting of what surrounds the characters, the way they talk, the way they act, what they do, the way they think. It is a total immersion experience. And that is what I've always tried to do in my own books, is not to explain the history, but to simply immerse you in in the sense of what it was like to be a human being in a particular historical period. So Patrick O'Brian, I guess, would be my big influence for how to write historical fiction, even though I do not in any way pretend to be an imitator of his, but just that ability to, without judgment, without the sort of skewering perspective of the contemporary looking back on the past, to just accept it as it is, and to create that immersive experience for the reader, I think, is what I've always aspired to do with my own fiction.
Well, on that note, Patrick.
Yeah. Sorry, I am known for giving very long-winded responses.
No, it's fascinating, but I think it's a perfect note to end on, unless there's some question that is so pressing that
the only other thing is, can you repeat the name of the Vera Brittain memoir?
Oh, yes. It's called Testament of Youth. It's been actually made into a movie. I have opinions about the movie. But I think if you it's certainly worth seeing if you read the book and become as sort of obsessed with it as I was. Certainly worth seeing. There's also a BBC series from way back during the 1970s, during that sort of feminist rediscovery of Vera Brittain. And but the book itself, Testament of Youth, really, there's a lot of sort of technical stuff about her journey to get into Oxford and all the exams she had to pass to get in, and you sort of get a bit bogged down in all the Latin and Greek that she had to study for in the early paragraph. But the story arc itself is just so incredibly moving and gives you such a wonderful snapshot of that generation, what is often called, the lost generation of young people who fought in the war and either survived or died in the war, the First World War. So that definitely worth a read if you're interested in the period.
Indeed,
Awesome.
It is. Well, thank you for all that. It's been fascinating as always to talk
great.
to you, Beatrice. So The Wicked Widow, we do have just a few left, but we probably could get Beatrice to sign more if we have.
I am always happy. Yes. What we do is they send me boxes of books. I sign them and stick my little postcards and bookmarks in there, and then they send me these lovely UPS labels that I slap on the boxes and send them back. So it's very easy process. And, certainly if anyone has a particular personalization request, we can accommodate that as well. Obviously the timing, you're going to have to wait a bit for your book, but I'm sure we can get something to you by the holidays if you
I wish we could, but I'm going to have to intervene and say there's no chance.
Okay.
So overbooked. Sorry, we are just completely overbooked and overwhelmed. And not only that,
that's good news. I'm so excited that so much, bookish commerce is taking place.
It really is. But I think we all have to recognize too that the shipping systems are going to be strained beyond their capacity. So we can certainly do that, but we really have to wait till January because it's just, everything is so backed up at the moment. But it's a happy thought. And you can always download the audiobook or read the ebook while you're waiting for your beautiful signed copy. It's not impossible to have both, which I love. Anyway, Beatrice, thank you for your time.
Do both. They listen to the audio and have the physical copy as well, which I think is kind of neat because it allows you to go back and forth or to read it and then listen to it or listen and then read. Yeah. So
absolutely true. In fact, the people that read audiobooks sometimes are stars in their own right, which is very cool.
I have been very fortunate to have some amazing narrators for my audiobook. So they're so good that and whenever anyone asks me to read an excerpt, I'm like, no. I cannot compete with that level of professionalism whatsoever. So I will tell you all about the book, the background, the insights, the themes, but no, I'm not going to read from it. Sorry. Get the audio. But hey, I got all these kids to put through college. So,
That's right. Good. An
every
excellent
royalty
thought.
dollar counts.
I love it. It's always been a treat to talk to you. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching us this evening. There will be, speaking of audio, a podcast available towards the end of the week in case you'd like to listen to what we had to say. And the video is going to live forever on our Facebook page and our YouTube page because we're making that available. We'd really like to encourage you to sign up for our YouTube channel because that's a nice thing that will help us do some more interesting work. Anyway, happy holidays.
Good
Happy
night.
Thanksgiving. All that
Happy
good
holidays,
stuff.
everyone.
Right. And thank you again, Beatriz. Good night, everybody.
Absolutely, anytime.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.